The dust had barely settled across the jagged, unforgiving peaks of the Hindu Kush in October 2001 when the United States military decided to throw the most expensive, heavily armed welcome party in modern combat history. The Pentagon, desperate to project absolute unified power after the devastating attacks of September 11, aggressively formed Task Force K-Bar, an elite multinational special operations command designed to completely eradicate the al-Qaeda leadership. On paper, it was an absolutely flawless, terrifying alliance of Western might. High-ranking American generals, sitting in perfectly climate-controlled Washington offices, proudly merged their heavily funded American units with the absolute cream of the Commonwealth. This included the legendary British 22nd SAS and the ruthlessly efficient Australian SASR. To the politicians shaking hands for the cameras, it was the perfect union of the world's most elite killers. But down in the suffocating heat of the Afghan reality, it was the explosive beginning of a brutal, deeply embarrassing culture clash. The Commonwealth veterans arrived in the theater with a chilling, understated quietness that the American commanders initially mistook for a lack of aggression or technological inferiority. These were hardened men who had spent decades perfecting the brutal art of silent warfare in the world's most unforgiving environments, from the jungles of Malaya to the bogs of Ireland. They expected a gritty, exhausting, and completely invisible campaign against a hardened enemy who knew every inch of the rocks. Instead, they walked straight into an American operation that looked less like a military deployment and far more like a traveling corporate circus. The contrast was absolutely staggering to the professional eye. While the British and Australian operators were focused entirely on blending into the hostile landscape, their new American partners seemed obsessed with dominating it through sheer, overwhelming noise and limitless cash. The United States military did not just arrive in Afghanistan, they aggressively colonized it with all the subtlety of a massive industrial sledgehammer. Almost overnight, the Americans erected massive, sprawling forward operating bases that permanently scarred the desolate landscape and announced their presence to every tribal fighter within 50 miles. These were not temporary, camouflaged outposts designed to hide troops. They were blazing cities in the desert, instantly becoming the loudest, brightest, and most obvious targets in the entire region. Giant, deafening diesel generators roared continuously 24 hours a day, shaking the very earth to pump electricity into massive command tents. Unbelievably, massive air conditioning units blasted freezing air to keep the troops perfectly comfortable, even as the crisp autumn chill was already setting in across the mountains. While the enemy was surviving on stale bread and freezing caves, the American war machine was flying in hot, perfectly prepared steaks and serving them 3 times a day to their troops. For the British and Australian SAS, this was the first strike in a disastrous clash of military philosophies that would eventually lead to bloodshed. For the American generals, war was treated less like a gritty, life-or-death struggle for survival and far more like the high-stakes production of a remarkably expensive Hollywood blockbuster. Their entire tactical approach, proudly labeled direct action, was deeply unsubtle and relied entirely on massive industrial superiority rather than human tradecraft. The American plan was brutally simple and shockingly loud. Load heavily armed, aggressively confident troops into massive transport helicopters, fly them directly at the target with deafening noise, bomb everything that moved into absolute dust, and fly away before the smoke even had a chance to clear. It looked phenomenal on a general's briefing slide, a perfect demonstration of overwhelming, unstoppable American firepower. But out in the sprawling, echoing valleys of the Afghan mountains, this spectacular strategy possessed a fatal, almost comical flaw that the Taliban exploited daily. The Americans were basically ringing a giant dinner bell for the enemy every time they decided to launch a mission. The deafening roar of those multi-million-dollar rotor blades echoed violently through the mountain passes, acting as a massive, unmistakable alarm bell for the local fighters. The Taliban did not need advanced radar to know the Americans were coming. They could hear the thumping blades of the approaching Blackhawks and Chinooks from 10 kilometers away. By the time the heavily armed American forces actually kicked down the doors and stormed the targets, they were usually dropping millions of dollars worth of ordnance on completely empty rocks. The enemy had simply melted away into the shadows hours before the helicopters even arrived. To the hardened, highly disciplined operators of the British and Australian SAS, Watching this arrogant, incredibly loud display of military excess was physically painful. It was like watching a clumsy, overweight hunter stomping through a dry forest with a brass band playing right behind him, genuinely wondering why he could not catch a single ghost. The Commonwealth Special Forces had been forged in the grueling, suffocating jungles of Malaya and the freezing bogs of Northern Ireland, where absolute invisibility was the only guarantee of making it back alive. They understood that in an asymmetrical war against a deeply entrenched insurgency, noise is not a weapon. Noise is a fatal vulnerability that gets men killed. Combining their meticulous, incredibly silent tradecraft with the booming, unavoidable footprint of the United States military was an absolute professional nightmare for the SAS. But the friction was only just beginning to heat up. The cultural divide quickly hardened into open, undisguised contempt when the Americans caught their very first glimpse of the Australian transport vehicles. United States commanders, wrapped safely in their heavily armored convoys, openly scoffed at the Commonwealth's choice of ride. The Australian SASR had rolled into the war zone driving long-range patrol vehicles, heavily modified open-top dirt buggies that looked like props from a movie. There was absolutely no heavy armor plating on the Australian vehicles. There were no enclosed cabins, no blast-proof doors, and certainly no air conditioning to protect the operators. To the heavily protected Americans, the vehicles looked like outdated, completely suicidal relics from a forgotten desert war of the past century. One American officer allegedly sneered that the Australian buggies looked like cheap props from a bad historical movie rather than modern combat tools. But the Australians did not care about looking modern, and they certainly did not care about American opinions on comfort. They cared about lethal autonomy and the ability to disappear. The long-range patrol vehicles were completely stripped down for a very specific, highly aggressive reason. Without the massive weight of heavy armor and enclosed cabins, the buggies could carry incredible amounts of essential survival gear. The Australians strapped massive canisters of fuel, heavy ammunition crates, and weeks' worth of drinking water to every single inch of the exposed frames. Instead of relying on a massive, highly visible supply chain to constantly feed them hot steaks, the Commonwealth operators loaded their vehicles to the absolute brim and simply disappeared. They drove out of the glaring, noisy American bases and vanished into the absolute worst, most unforgiving stretches of the deep desert. They embraced a level of total isolation that the American corporate army could not even begin to comprehend or replicate. For 21 grueling days at a time, the Australian patrols operated completely alone, entirely cut off from the massive logistical umbilical cord that kept the American forces tied to their comfortable bases. But this was only the first strike in proving their terrifying superiority. They did not want the comfort. They actively despised it. They wanted the complete, undetectable freedom that only true, brutal isolation could provide. Out in the freezing, dust-choked wilderness, there were no roaring generators to mask the sound of an approaching enemy. There were no bright floodlights to blind their night vision, and no air conditioners to dull their senses to the environment. There was only the suffocating silence, the biting cold, and the absolute certainty that if they made a single mistake, no heavily armed rescue helicopter was coming to save them. This was the environment where the Australian and British SAS truly thrived, operating as silent, lethal phantoms, while the American war machine clumsily crashed through the mountains behind them. The tension between the loud, heavily armored Americans and the silent, highly disciplined Commonwealth operators was rapidly reaching a boiling point. The generals in their clean cabinets had demanded a unified coalition, but down in the dirty, freezing reality of the Afghan war, the two vastly different philosophies were already on a catastrophic collision course. The American obsession with noise and overwhelming firepower was about to violently clash with the Commonwealth's absolute dedication to stealth. The American generals genuinely believed they were invincible, wrapped in their heavy armor and shielded by their massive budgets. They had absolutely no idea that their arrogant, incredibly noisy approach was dragging the entire coalition straight toward a devastating, bloody catastrophe, and that entirely preventable catastrophe was already waiting for them in the freezing heights of the Shahikot Valley. How is it that the Pentagon spent years trying to bury the truth about this day? Why do official U.S. reports lie about who actually saved their soldiers from total annihilation? As the planning for Operation Anaconda began, the SAS operators were already seeing the cracks in the American strategy. They tried to warn their allies that the mountains were alive with hidden eyes, but the Americans only laughed. They were about to fly into a meat grinder, and only the vagabonds they had mocked would have the skills to pull them back from the brink of extinction. The secret to the absolute invisibility of the Australian and British SAS was not found in advanced technology or multi-million-dollar stealth cloaks. It was found in a brutal, uncompromising level of physical and psychological discipline, known simply as the hard routine. To fully understand what this meant, you have to completely forget everything Hollywood has taught you about special forces. The American military doctrine believed that a soldier needed to be comfortable to be effective, which meant hot food, warm tents, and regular communication. The Commonwealth operators believed that comfort was a deadly trap that made you soft, loud, and entirely predictable. When an SAS patrol disappeared into the mountains or the desert, they completely severed themselves from the modern world and all its noise. For weeks on end, they consumed absolutely nothing but freezing cold combat rations, eating straight from the sealed foil packaging without ever using a stove. Lighting a fire or firing up a small chemical stove was a cardinal sin, an absolute violation of their most sacred rule. In the still, freezing air of an Afghan mountain valley, the faint chemical smell of heated food or the sudden thermal bloom of a tiny flame could be detected by a trained enemy observer from hundreds of meters away. While the American soldiers were loudly complaining about the temperature of their bacon in the brightly lit megabases, the Australian operators were quietly chewing on frozen paste, refusing to even whisper a single word of complaint. But the true horror of the hard routine went far beyond eating cold food in total silence. When the tactical situation demanded absolute undetectable stealth, Australian operators would utilize what they called spider holes. These were not the hastily dug trenches you see in old war footage. They were meticulously engineered pits. A spider hole was a meticulously engineered, incredibly claustrophobic pit carved directly into the freezing, rock-hard earth, often positioned dangerously close to heavily armed Taliban patrols. Two men would slide into this dirt grave, completely camouflaging the opening above them until they practically ceased to exist to the naked eye. And then the true test of their iron will began. They would lie in that suffocating hole for 24, 48, or sometimes even 72 grueling hours at a time. They could not stand up. They could not stretch their cramping, freezing limbs. They could not even speak to each other, communicating only through a complex, silent vocabulary of hand gestures. Most shockingly, they absolutely could not leave the hole to relieve themselves. They soiled themselves exactly where they lay, meticulously wrapping and sealing their own waste in plastic bags. This stomach-turning level of discipline was absolutely vital because the highly trained dogs used by Taliban trackers could easily catch the faintest whiff of human scent if a single mistake was made. It was a staggering display of sheer willpower and psychological endurance that the American corporate army simply could not comprehend or ever hope to replicate. While the Americans were loudly frying meat and blasting their radios back at the camp, the elite operators of the Australian SAS did not even dare to cough. But this incredible, life-saving discipline was constantly being jeopardized by the overwhelming incompetence of the American command structure. The United States headquarters, obsessed with micromanaging the war from comfortable desks far away from the front line, demanded that all coalition units follow their strict communication protocols. They ordered the Commonwealth patrols to regularly power up their radios. The American generals ordered the Commonwealth patrols to regularly power up their radios and broadcast their exact coordinates back to the base, just so a staff officer could check a box on a daily report. For an Australian operator buried alive in a spider hole, surrounded by the enemy and operating in absolute silence, turning on a powerful radio transmitter was practically a written invitation for an artillery strike. The Taliban fighters were not primitive cavemen. They had captured advanced Russian direction-finding equipment and knew exactly how to triangulate electronic signals. Every single time an American officer demanded a routine check-in from the field, they were practically painting a bright red target on the backs of their own allies. The frustration among the Commonwealth forces was rapidly turning into a boiling, uncontainable fury. Australian patrols were repeatedly forced to abandon perfectly laid ambushes. Painfully constructed ambushes and scramble away in the dead of night, all because a loud, clumsy American patrol had blundered into their sector with their radios blazing. The American noise completely ruined days of agonizing, silent preparation. The United States command structure was not just frustratingly annoying, Its absolute refusal to understand the delicate art of silent warfare was becoming a lethal threat to the men who actually knew what they were doing. Going into a stealth reconnaissance mission with the American military was exactly like trying to hunt a highly dangerous predator while dragging a full brass band behind you. The American generals genuinely believed they were invincible, wrapped in their heavy armor and shielded by their massive budgets. They had no idea their noise was fatal. The American obsession with industrial power and high-tech gadgets blinded them to the simple reality of the mountain terrain. They assumed that because they had thermal sensors and satellites, the enemy was already defeated. But the Taliban were masters of the shadows, and they were watching the noisy Americans with patient, hungry eyes. The Commonwealth operators tried to explain that the electronic signatures the Americans were leaking were giving away every troop movement. Their warnings were met with condescending smiles from officers who had never spent a night in a spider hole. To the Pentagon, the Australians were just relics who didn't understand modern, high-speed warfare. But the relics were the ones who saw the trap being set in the Shah-e-Khat Valley. They saw the enemy reinforcing the high ridges, while the Americans were busy building gyms. As March 2002 approached, the tension between the two forces reached a breaking point. The Americans were preparing for a massive air assault, a show of force that they believed would end the local resistance forever. The SAS teams on the ground reported that the valley floor was a kill zone, but the American planners refused to listen to low-tech intelligence. They wanted their big, cinematic victory. The Australian and British commanders were left with a terrifying choice: follow the American plan and risk certain death, or find a way to operate outside the system. They knew that when the first American helicopter touched down, the valley would turn into a slaughterhouse. The vagabonds began to quietly prepare for a rescue mission they knew was coming, even as the Americans continued to laugh at their beards. The Commonwealth operators began secretly stockpiling extra ammunition and medical supplies, knowing they would soon be the only ones capable of holding the high ground. They watched the American Black Hawks and Chinooks being prepped for the assault, knowing those multi-million-dollar machines were headed for a graveyard. The arrogance of the American leadership was so thick it was almost tangible in the desert air. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they failed to notice the enemy had moved heavy anti-aircraft guns into the very caves the Americans planned to clear. The SAS saw it all through their long-range optics, lying in the dirt for days without moving. They were the only ones who knew the truth. And the truth was that the pride of the U.S. military was about to be humbled. The American command structure was a bloated beast, incapable of moving with the speed or silence required for mountain combat. It relied on a chain of command that was thousands of miles long, while the SAS relied on the man standing next to them. This fundamental difference in philosophy was about to be tested in the most violent way possible. When the orders for Operation Anaconda were finally signed, the Commonwealth teams knew the countdown to disaster had begun. They didn't have the luxury of air-conditioned tents or hot steaks anymore. They had to prepare for a fight that would redefine the relationship between the Allies forever. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the American generals were ready for their close-up, completely unaware that the script had already been flipped. How could the most powerful military in history walk into such an obvious ambush? The answer lies in the same arrogance that made them scoff at the Australian buggies. They believed that noise was power, and they were about to learn that in the mountains, silence is the only thing that keeps you breathing. The Commonwealth operators prepared to walk into the valley on foot, rejecting the help of American transport. They knew they would be alone, and they were perfectly fine with that. As the sun began to set on the day before the assault, the SAS teams vanished into the darkness. They were moving toward the high ridges of Takur Ghar, heading for the very heart of the enemy's strength. They were going to save the men who had mocked them. The mountains were waiting, and the Taliban were waiting, and the American generals were still looking at their beautiful, flawed slides. The disaster was inevitable, but the response of the Commonwealth forces would become the stuff of legend. They were about to prove that 150 men with the right mindset were worth more than an entire division of loud amateurs. As the first light of dawn hit the peaks, the sound of the first American rotors began to echo through the valley. The hard routine was over, and the killing was about to begin. The silent ghosts were in position, watching the Americans fly into the jaws of the beast. The slaughter was only minutes away, and the Pentagon would never be the same again after this day. By the time the calendar turned to March 2002, the Pentagon was desperately itching for a massive, decisive victory to show the world. They drew up a colossal, heavy-handed blueprint designed to crush the remaining al-Qaeda forces hiding in the eastern mountains of Afghanistan. They proudly named it Operation Anaconda, a title meant to evoke the image of a massive predator slowly suffocating its prey with overwhelming strength. The plan was classic American direct action, relying entirely on overwhelming industrial power and a shocking lack of tactical subtlety. The strategy was to load hundreds of conventional troops and elite Navy SEALs into massive transport helicopters and drop them directly on top of the enemy ridges in broad daylight. It was loud, it was wildly aggressive, and it was supposed to be a flawless demonstration of unstoppable American firepower that would leave no survivors among the retreating enemy forces. But the seasoned operators of the Australian and British SAS, who had been silently stalking the Shah-e-Khat Valley for weeks in their freezing spider holes, knew the terrifying truth about the terrain. They urgently warned the American generals that their intelligence was catastrophically wrong and that the valley floor was a natural killing ground for any airborne assault. The Commonwealth teams reported that the valley was crawling with heavily armed fighters, and the specific ridges the Americans planned to land on were heavily fortified traps. These were entrenched anti-aircraft positions that had been meticulously prepared for months to catch a landing force exactly like this one. The Australians explicitly told the Pentagon that flying slow transport helicopters into that valley during the day was pure, unadulterated suicide. Do you know what an arrogant general does when he is handed a brutally honest truth that breaks his multi-million-dollar plan? He ignores it entirely because his ego and the pressure for a fast victory outweigh the survival of the men on the ground. The American command structure simply brushed the Commonwealth warnings aside, utterly blinded by their own faith in their heavy armor and overwhelming numbers. They refused to alter a single detail of their grandiose operation, ordering the assault to proceed exactly as it had been drawn on the briefing slides. The trap was set, the warnings were completely ignored, and the arrogant American machine was about to fly straight into the bloodiest meat grinder of the early war. 3 full days before the arrogant, deafening roar of the American helicopters was scheduled to violently shatter the mountain silence, the elite operators of the Australian SASR and the British 22nd SAS made a brutally pragmatic decision to protect themselves. If they were going to survive the incredibly obvious, entirely preventable bloodbath the Pentagon had just designed, they had to completely rewrite the rules of the mission for their own units. They entirely rejected the use of transport helicopters, bluntly refusing to rely on any form of loud, highly visible American machinery for their insertion. Instead of flying comfortably into a heavily fortified kill zone, the Commonwealth elite chose to walk straight into hell entirely on their own terms, carrying agonizing, spine-crushing loads that weighed upwards of 50 kilograms per man. The British and Australian specialists began a punishing infiltration of the hostile territory on foot. Their massive, overloaded rucksacks were stuffed with heavy sniper systems, laser targeting designators, and enough freezing cold combat rations to survive in complete, utter isolation for at least 3 grueling weeks without any resupply. Moving only under the cover of absolute pitch-black darkness, they slowly scaled sheer, unforgiving rock faces that American intelligence analysts sitting safely in their tents had confidently declared to be impassable. They pushed their bodies to the absolute brink of human endurance, battling hurricane-force mountain winds that sent the temperature plummeting to a bone-snapping -18 degrees Celsius. But the brutal climb was only the first grueling test of their legendary endurance, as the altitude began to take a heavy toll. As they ascended past 3,000 meters of altitude, the freezing, oxygen-starved air burned their lungs like inhaled glass with every single labored breath they took. Yet driven by pure, unrelenting willpower and decades of brutal training, they continued their agonizing climb, perfectly executing the punishing discipline of their Commonwealth hard routine. They were ghosts, moving through the frozen peaks. Long before the sun finally rose on the designated day of the American assault, the joint Australian and British teams had already successfully secured completely invisible, heavily camouflaged observation posts. They were high above the heavily fortified enemy positions, looking down into the very jaws of the trap. They were freezing, and they were utterly exhausted, but they had successfully secured the ultimate tactical high ground without being detected once. They lay perfectly motionless in the deep snow, their weapons completely ready, watching the sprawling valley below with ice-cold, terrifying patience. They were entirely invisible to the hundreds of heavily armed Taliban fighters swarming the jagged ridges just a few hundred meters below them. For days, the Commonwealth operators endured the agonizing, life-threatening cold, absolutely refusing to light a single warming fire or even whisper. They silently waited for the entirely preventable American disaster to finally unfold before their eyes. And then, right on schedule, the deafening American war machine finally arrived, flying completely blind directly into the waiting guns. In the early freezing hours of March 2nd, the United States military flew directly into the brutal, heavily fortified buzzsaw that the British and Australian SAS had so desperately warned them about. As the massive, incredibly loud Chinook helicopters began their clumsy descent toward the treacherous ridges of Takur Gar, the silent mountain suddenly erupted in a terrifying, overwhelming storm of fire. The Taliban fighters, perfectly positioned in the exact hidden trenches the Commonwealth operators had identified days earlier, unleashed a devastating, highly coordinated barrage of heavy machine gun fire and armor-piercing rockets directly into the American aircraft. The trap had violently snapped shut, and the consequences for the Americans were immediate, bloody, and absolutely catastrophic. The loud, arrogant American military machine instantly shattered its teeth against the silent, unforgiving Afghan rocks. A massive MH-47 Chinook carrying an elite team of Navy SEALs took multiple devastating hits as it desperately tried to touch down on a heavily fortified ridge. In the terrifying, screaming chaos of the emergency evasive maneuvers, an American operator plummeted from the open rear ramp of the critically damaged helicopter. He fell directly into the freezing snow, entirely alone, completely surrounded by highly trained, heavily armed enemy fighters in the absolute worst possible place on Earth. The critically damaged American Chinook violently slammed into the ground further down the jagged mountain, leaving the supposedly invincible United States elite pinned down. Complete and utter panic began to flood the American radio frequencies as multiple separated military units desperately screamed for immediate heavy support from anyone who could hear them. Their terrified, frantic transmissions constantly overlapped and contradicted each other, causing the heavily centralized American command structure back at Bagram Air Base to completely lose control of the battle. The United States forces were brutally pinned to the frozen earth, taking heavy casualties, and they had absolutely no idea where the devastating, highly accurate enemy fire was actually coming from. The perfect multi-million-dollar American plan had entirely disintegrated into a desperate scramble for survival in a matter of terrifying minutes. But high above the burning American wreckage and the screaming, panicked radios buried deep in the freezing snow, the invisible men were already moving. The British and Australian SAS were preparing to do the absolute impossible from their hidden perches. This was exactly the moment the men the Americans had mockingly called outdated vagabonds finally went to work. While the heavily armed Americans panicked and bled in the dirt below, the Australian and British operators remained as cold, calculated, and utterly emotionless as the glacial ice surrounding them. From their heavily hidden vantage points, high above the bloody kill zone, the Commonwealth forward observers had an absolutely perfect, unobstructed view of the entire chaotic battlefield. They could clearly see the hidden Taliban trenches that the Americans could not see through the smoke. They could easily identify the heavy weapon emplacements tearing the Navy SEALs apart, and most importantly, they knew exactly how to destroy them. With surgical, terrifying precision, the British communications experts and the highly trained Australian spotters began feeding perfectly calculated, incredibly lethal coordinates directly to the heavily armed coalition fighter jets. These jets were frantically circling high above the chaos, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the swirling snow and smoke of the crash site. The panicked American pilots initially could not comprehend what was happening on their targeting screens as the data flowed in. They were suddenly receiving targeting data with such impossible speed and absolutely flawless accuracy that they assumed the elite spotters had to be sitting comfortably in a high-tech command center. They had absolutely no idea that the incredibly precise coordinates saving their fellow Americans were coming from men lying flat in the freezing snow. The SAS operators were freezing in -8-degree weather more than 3,000 meters up a jagged, hostile mountain ridge, while they calmly directed the destruction of the enemy. But aggressively calling in devastating airstrikes was only the first part of the massive Commonwealth counterattack. As the incredibly heavy bombs began to violently smash the enemy fortifications into dust, the elite Australian snipers finally joined the brutal fight. Operating from extreme, breathtaking distances ranging from 600 to over 1,100 meters away, they began systematically dismantling the Taliban heavy gunners who were pinning the Americans down. Each shot was a masterpiece of ballistic calculation and iron discipline. The hunters had become the hunted, and the vagabonds were now the only thing standing between the Americans and a total massacre. Executing a perfect sniper shot at that staggering, almost impossible distance requires far more than just pulling a trigger. It requires the absolute, complete mastery of human physiology and psychological control. The Australian shooters had to completely suppress their own violent, uncontrollable shivering, manually slow their racing heart rates in the incredibly thin mountain air, and perfectly calculate the highly erratic freezing crosswinds before every single deadly squeeze of the trigger. And the terrifying truth is, they did not miss a single shot during the entire engagement. The Taliban fighters, who only moments ago believed they were effortlessly slaughtering the supposedly elite Americans, suddenly found themselves being aggressively erased from existence by an entirely invisible, completely silent enemy. They could not hear the distant suppressed shots, and they could not see the hidden muzzle flashes in the blinding snow. They simply dropped dead where they stood. The sheer, overwhelming, almost superhuman discipline of the British and Australian hard routine was finally bearing its lethal fruit on the jagged slopes of Takur Ghar. The incredible Australian snipers and the highly advanced British forward air controllers, working in perfect, deadly, totally silent harmony, systematically broke the back of the massive enemy ambush without ever once revealing their own hidden positions. They completely saved the elite American forces from total annihilation, dominating the entire battlefield while remaining absolute untouchable ghosts in the freezing snow. By the time the heavy, acrid smoke finally cleared from the Shah-e-Khat Valley and the exhausted, battered American forces were hastily extracted, the stark reality of the two vastly different military philosophies was laid completely bare for the entire world to analyze. The Americans had the technology, but the Commonwealth had the professional soul of the true warrior. Operation Anaconda officially dragged on until the 18th of March 2002, and when the final grim tallies were counted, the results were incredibly sobering for the Pentagon leadership. The United States military had suffered devastating, highly publicized losses, including the tragic death of 8 highly trained servicemen, most of whom fell during those catastrophic first 48 hours when the American command blindly followed its own arrogant plan. They had lost multi-million-dollar aircraft, expended an absolute fortune in heavy ordnance, and suffered a massive public humiliation that the Pentagon PR machine desperately tried to spin as a hard-fought, heroic victory. But what about the Commonwealth forces who had walked in on foot? The British and Australian operators, the men who had stubbornly walked into the freezing mountains with 50-kilogram packs and explicitly warned the Americans of the deadly trap, suffered exactly 0 fatalities. Not a single Commonwealth operator was lost during the entire ordeal, despite being closer to the enemy for longer periods than almost any other unit. Even more shockingly, when the classified, highly sensitive after-action reports were finally filed, the American command was forced to admit a deeply uncomfortable truth in writing. Admiral Harward's own internal assessment revealed that the tiny contingent of 150 Australian operators had single-handedly produced over 50% of all the actionable intelligence gathered by the entire, massive coalition force during the campaign. A tiny fraction of the men, using 0 transport helicopters and demanding absolutely 0 comfort, had effectively done more than half the work for a sprawling coalition of thousands. The sheer, undeniable arithmetic of that fact required absolutely no further interpretation. It was the ultimate, indisputable proof of the superiority of the silent professional approach. In the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Afghan mountains, the silent discipline of the Commonwealth would always completely triumph over the noisy hubris of the American military machine. But if you think the Pentagon publicly thanked the Australian and British operators for pulling their elite troops out of the fire, you do not understand how military politics work. In the official press briefings and highly publicized reports released by the United States, the massive contributions of the SAS were incredibly downplayed, reduced to mere footnotes, or completely ignored altogether. The American generals aggressively patted themselves on the back, loudly congratulating their own forces while practically erasing the silent professionals who had actually saved the entire operation from total disaster. For the hardened men of the Commonwealth, it was a bitter, incredibly frustrating pill to swallow after risking everything. The British and Australian operators had done the impossible. They had kept the Americans alive, and their only reward was a staggering display of bureaucratic ingratitude and strategic blindness. But this incredibly toxic tension was only the first strike in a conflict that was about to permanently fracture the coalition for years to come. Instead of humbly learning from this incredible display of professional mastery, the massive American military bureaucracy did exactly what massive bureaucracies always do. They arrogantly doubled down on their own flawed system. The Pentagon continued to fiercely try and force the British and Australian operators into their rigid, noisy, and deeply ineffective framework. They continued to loudly demand constant radio check-ins, heavily centralized planning, and rapid, aggressive action that completely ignored the painstaking, highly dangerous intelligence gathering of the SAS teams. The Commonwealth operators, who had just risked their lives to save the Americans from their own sheer incompetence, were rapidly reaching the absolute limit of their professional patience with Washington. The friction that had started as a quiet, polite disagreement in October 2001 was now violently boiling over into open, undeniable resentment among the rank and file. The absolute final straw, the devastating event that finally shattered the illusion of a unified coalition forever, arrived a few years later in the treacherous, unforgiving deserts of Uruzgan province. It was 2006, and the Taliban insurgency was violently surging back across the southern regions of Afghanistan, aggressively reclaiming territory, while the Americans were distracted by Iraq. An elite Australian reconnaissance team had successfully tracked a massive, highly secretive logistical hub used by the Taliban to funnel heavily armed couriers and advanced weaponry. This was not a minor target. This was the beating heart of the local insurgency, and the Australians had it firmly in their sights. For 7 grueling days, the Australians lay completely motionless in their agonizing spider holes, silently mapping the complex enemy network while enduring unimaginable physical discomfort. They painstakingly identified the crucial delivery routes. They precisely documented the daily routines of the guards, and they patiently waited for the absolute perfect moment to strike. The SAS commanders urgently requested to hold their fire for just 3 more days, waiting for the high-ranking enemy financiers and senior operational commanders to gather in one single, highly vulnerable location. They wanted to deliver one flawless, completely devastating blow that would completely decapitate the terror network in a single night. But the American command structure was obsessed with flashy results. The United States command structure, entirely obsessed with generating rapid results for their daily press briefings, aggressively demanded immediate, noisy action against the facility. They flatly refused to wait, completely ignoring the furious, highly vocal protests of the Australian officers who had done all the actual work. The United States forces launched a massive, entirely premature strike on the facility using their standard, heavy-handed tactics and loud helicopters. The result was exactly the disaster the SAS had desperately feared from the very beginning of the mission. A few low-level, easily replaceable couriers were neutralized in the noisy assault. But the high-ranking targets, warned by the approaching chaos, instantly vanished into the deep mountains. The entire high-level Taliban network completely survived, immediately relocated their operations, and smoothly continued funding the deadly insurgency that killed coalition soldiers. A full week of agonizing, freezing observation by the elite Australian operators had been completely ruined, just so an ambitious American officer could quickly check a box. For the Americans, this completely botched operation was just another generic line item in a massive, sprawling spreadsheet of daily activities. But for the incredibly disciplined Australians, it was an absolute, unforgivable spit in the face and a betrayal of professional trust. They realized in that exact infuriating moment that the American obsession with immediate explosive action was not just highly ineffective, it was actively destroying their ability to fight the war properly. The British and Australian Special Forces had finally seen enough of the bureaucratic incompetence from their allies. They were no longer willing to sacrifice their hard-earned intelligence and risk their operators' lives for a command structure that valued loud PR victories. The Commonwealth commanders were moving toward a completely unprecedented move that would change the entire conduct of the war in their sectors. When you push the best in the world too far, they simply stop taking your orders and start looking for a better way to win. The botched operation in Uruzgan province was not just an unfortunate tactical error, it was the final, fatal blow to a partnership that had been bleeding trust for years. The British and Australian Special Forces, men who survived by measuring risks perfectly, realized that their American allies were no longer just loud. They had become a liability. The Commonwealth commanders looked at the sprawling, heavily centralized, incredibly rigid American war machine and decided they simply did not need it anymore. They were going to start their own secret war. The Commonwealth was about to draw a line in the sand that the Pentagon would never be allowed to cross again. This wasn't about ego. It was about the survival of their men and the integrity of their mission in a country that ate loud soldiers for breakfast. The silent professionals were preparing to vanish from the American radar and operate in a way that Washington could neither monitor nor control. The era of cooperation was ending, and the era of the secret war was about to begin in the shadows of the Afghan peaks. The Americans were left with their steaks and their air conditioning, while the SAS prepared to go even deeper into the darkness. The vagabonds were officially taking over, and the Taliban were the only ones who truly understood how dangerous that was. The botched operation in Uruzgan province was not just an unfortunate tactical error, it was the final, fatal blow to a partnership that had been bleeding trust for years. The British and Australian Special Forces, men who survived by measuring risks perfectly, realized that their American allies were no longer just loud and inefficient. They had become actively dangerous to the mission. The Commonwealth commanders looked at the sprawling, heavily centralized, incredibly rigid American war machine and decided they simply did not need it anymore. What happened next is one of the most fascinating, tightly guarded secrets of the entire Afghan campaign. The British and Australian SAS initiated a silent, entirely professional rebellion against the Pentagon dictates by effectively carving out their own private, highly lethal hunting grounds. They did not declare a formal split, but they practically drew a massive line across the map of southern Afghanistan and took absolute ownership. The British 22nd SAS Regiment aggressively claimed the nightmare province of Helmand, an absolute meat grinder where the Taliban insurgency was strongest and most entrenched. Simultaneously, the Australian SASR deployed exclusively into Uruzgan, a deeply traditional, fiercely guarded mountain province that served as the spiritual homeland and massive logistical hub for the enemy. The Commonwealth forces had successfully secured their own operational freedom, entirely free from the clumsy, constant American micromanagement that had ruined so many previous missions. Once they were securely established in Uruzgan, the Australian approach completely shifted away from the noisy, aggressive American model toward a more patient strategy. Instead of relying on massive drone strikes and kicking down doors for the cameras, the SASR operators went to work building incredibly complex, deeply rooted human intelligence networks. They spent agonizing months earning the trust of local informants and mapping the entire social geography. They understood a fundamental truth that the Pentagon refused to accept. True intelligence superiority cannot be purchased with multi-million-dollar surveillance aircraft or heavy armor. It must be earned by hardened men willing to bleed quietly in the dirt and wait for the perfect moment to strike. But geographical isolation was only the very beginning of the Commonwealth's massive strategic pivot away from the United States. Behind heavily closed doors, the British and Australian commanders initiated a profound operational shift that completely bypassed the American intelligence sharing network. Utilizing the highly classified framework of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the Commonwealth officers began routing their most sensitive, highly actionable intelligence directly to each other. They completely froze out the American analysts sitting in Washington because they no longer trusted their judgment. They had concluded through bitter experience that they trusted their own hardened operators infinitely more than the heavily processed reports. The British and Australian forces had effectively created a deeply secretive, highly efficient, parallel war right under the noses of the American generals. It was not treason, and it was certainly not sabotage. It was the ultimate, undeniable assertion of professional sovereignty in a theater of war. They were finally executing the campaign exactly the way it was meant to be fought, entirely free from the blundering interference of a misguided ally. They had successfully left the Americans behind, retreating into an incredibly elite closed-door club where silence, patience, and lethal precision were the only metrics that mattered. This astonishing act of professional defiance forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question that the Pentagon has spent decades trying to avoid. What exactly did the British and Australian operators possess that the United States military, with its limitless budget, could never seem to replicate? The brutal answer to that question is not found in their rifles, their vehicles, or their classified gear. It lies hidden in the selection process. The selection for the Special Air Service is universally acknowledged by experts as the most psychologically devastating trial ever devised by any modern military force. The American Special Operations System is undeniably exceptional at producing incredibly fit, highly aggressive soldiers who thrive within a massive, deeply supportive command structure. The Commonwealth system, however, is fundamentally designed to completely break a man down to his absolute core just to see if he can rebuild himself alone. During the infamous SAS selection course, hopeful candidates are not simply pushed to the point of physical exhaustion, they are violently pushed into a state of total isolation. They are handed impossibly heavy packs and ordered to march across treacherous, freezing mountain ranges without any established routes or instructions. The instructors do not scream at them. They do not motivate them. They completely ignore them to see if the candidates have internal drive. The overarching goal of the selection process is not to measure physical strength, but to discover if a candidate can continue to make rational decisions when alone. The failure rate for this brutal crucible regularly exceeds 85%, washing out some of the fittest conventional soldiers on the entire planet. The rare men who actually survive this terrifying psychological gauntlet are no longer just soldiers. They have been forged into self-sufficient instruments. They are the kind of men who can lie completely motionless in a freezing spider hole for 72 hours because their own internal discipline demands it. They are men who implicitly understand that absolute silence is a weapon far more devastating than a $20 million attack helicopter or a tank. The American system was brilliant at mass-producing highly effective parts for a massive machine, but the Commonwealth system wanted handcrafted independent thinkers. These thinkers possess the intellect to completely dismantle an enemy network in total darkness, without needing a massive supply chain behind them. When you step back and analyze the entire 20-year tragedy of the Afghan campaign, the staggering contrast between these two philosophies becomes undeniable. The politicians sitting comfortably in Washington ultimately lost the war on a massive strategic level as they watched trillions of dollars evaporate. The giant, brightly lit American megabases were eventually disbanded, and the roaring air conditioners were permanently shut off as the troops retreated. The overwhelming industrial approach ultimately failed to secure a lasting victory against a patient enemy who understood the value of time, but on the brutal, unforgiving tactical level, where the real war was actually fought every single day, the men of the SAS never lost. They completely dominated the enemy, they continuously outsmarted the hostile environment, and they repeatedly saved the lives of the Americans who mocked them. True undeniable professional mastery simply cannot be purchased with an unlimited defense budget. It is painfully forged in the absolute silence of the hard routine. It is brutally tested in the freezing bloody snow of Takur Ghar and proven when the loudest guys are screaming in panic. So the next time you see a highly polished Hollywood blockbuster praising the firepower of the American military machine, look past the explosions. Remember the silent, heavily bearded men who were watching from the freezing ridges above, the vagabonds who did the job.